Okay, so and I will also I'm placing it on our Facebook page also. So when you like, you can take it, and hopefully it will be a great presentation.
All
For
right,
sure.
well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me share my screen.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, we have it. It's okay. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you for having me. My name is Jon Yablonski. I'm a senior product designer at Boom Supersonic. And today I want to talk a little bit about cognitive bias and how that kind of intersects with the design process. So first up, a little bit about me. I'm a multidisciplinary designer. I'm a speaker, writer, digital creator. I am based right outside of Detroit here in the United States. And currently I'm working to build a dramatically more accessible world at Boom. You know, I'm really, as a designer, interested in this intersection between psychology and design. And so much so that I kind of wrote a book around this interest and really kind of why I think it's important for designers, called Laws of UX. You know, I really think as a designer, you know, psychology can be used to build better products and services that are just much more intuitive and human-centered. And this book really is an accessible introduction to the psychology fundamentals that have a direct influence on design and how people process and interact interfaces that we as designers create. I'm also keenly aware that you know, designers are susceptible to the same cognitive biases as our users, right? We're susceptible to the same fallacies in logic and judgment. And this can work its way into the design process if we're not very, you know, diligent to kind of identify it up front and to mitigate its influence on our work. Because ultimately it's gonna affect the product that we create. So this talk is really about some key guidelines that I believe are beneficial for designers to consider in their work, and to really kind of cultivate that awareness of when and how biases can be introduced into the design process and influence our decisions. The first I'll be talking about is why we should consider what we aren't seeing in things like design research. Secondly, why we should not build solutions in search of a problem. And thirdly, why we should be aware of our decision frames. I'll elaborate. So let's start with considering what we don't see. All right, so during World War II, Allied forces had a problem. They were sending off bombers to fight the Nazis in Europe, and obviously those bombers were being decimated by enemy fire. And the United States government contacted you know, researchers and universities in the United States to really kind of investigate why this was happening. And really what they discovered was, you know, after, you know, researchers had looked at this and kind of examined these planes that were coming back, that damage was being, you know, concentrated in these very specific areas of these bombers. And logically, they would assume this is where they needed to put more armor to protect these bombers better when they're, you know, doing bombing raids. It was this man, Abraham Wald, who actually kind of said, wait a minute, we're not looking at the entire data set. We're not considering the planes that didn't make it back at all. We're only considering the planes that survived. And counter to his other research colleagues, suggested that the plating should actually move to the parts of the plane where the damage wasn't concentrated. And his reasoning for this was that it was these areas that on the plane, once they sustained damage, the planes didn't make it back at all. And that was actually kind of where it was a fallacy in the thinking of the researchers, because they hadn't considered the planes that were not in their data set at all. I think this highlights a tendency we have as human beings to really concentrate on people that make it past a very specific selection process, right? We think we have a tendency to concentrate on the people or things that make it past this kind of process of visibility to our research. And typically that's because, you know, either we're not considering that it should be part of the data to begin with. And this can lead to a lot of false conclusions. And this is a tendency known as survivorship bias that can show up in the design process in a few critical ways. So how does this occur? The first is that, you know, it starts with in design research with the participants we actually choose, right? The people we decide to talk to. A lack of participant diversity will inevitably lead to a lack of data diversity. And it's only once we consider, if we're only considering one perspective, it will reduce the reliability of the data overall. Secondly, when we focus too much on only the positive feedback from our peers, it's likely to result in solutions that aren't resilient enough, right? So the best design solutions are the ones that consider a diversity of perspectives, specifically in regards to the people that will be using the end product or service that we're making. Okay, so how can we mitigate these risks? How can we mitigate the probability that these biases will influence our design decisions? Well, the first thing we can do is factor in failure. And tactically, what that means is do things like consider where things could potentially go wrong. We can, when we focus too much on success stories or positive metrics or even happy paths within our design solutions, we lose sight of how the design responds to when things fail. Secondly, we can really start to centralize these edge cases in our design process overall. We can make our designs more resilient by considering those unhappy paths and as thoroughly as we do the happy paths, right? So considering and centralizing when things could go wrong in our design creation process. And lastly, we can seek out diverse perspectives during design reviews. So the more kind of diverse perspective up front while we're looking at the review and evaluating its effectiveness, the more likely that we're creating resilient design solutions. The second thing we can do is to avoid survivorship bias is really recognize the limitations of quantitative data. What does this mean? It means considering what it's not telling us to make more informed design decisions, much like the bombers and Wald identifying that a missing critical piece of the data set was the planes that didn't make it back at all. We can do very similar things in the design process where we're considering what parts of the data that we just aren't considering whatsoever in our data set, and then start to kind of identify how we can get a more complete data set. We can also look for the opportunity beyond the bounds of the current best. You know, quantitative data, a lot of times, it'll tell us what people are doing at that moment, at that time, with the current solution. What it's not really telling us is what's beyond that. What could be better than the current best scenario? All right, so the next one I want to talk about is why we shouldn't build solutions in search of a problem. So in 1979 at Stanford University, there was a study done concerning capital punishment. In this study, each participant read a comparison of US states with and without the death penalty, and then a comparison of the murder rates in a state after the introduction of the death penalty. And then participants were asked whether or not they had changed their opinion about whether or not death penalty should exist. Next, they read a more detailed account of each comparison's procedure and had to rate the research whether or not it was well conducted and convincing. What participants were told was that one comparison supported the deterrent effect of capital punishment, and the other comparison undermined it. While for the participants, the other participants, the conclusion was swapped. The fact was both of these comparisons were completely fictional. So the participants, whether they were supporters or opponents of capital punishment, reported shifting their attitude slightly in the direction of the first comparison they actually read. And after reading a more detailed descriptions of the two comparisons, almost all of the participants returned to their original belief, regardless of the evidence provided, pointing to details that supported their viewpoints and disregarding anything that was contrary to their original viewpoint. The results illustrated that people set higher standards of evidence and hypotheses that go against their current expectations. And I think this study does a good job of highlighting a very important thing about human biases, right? We tend to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms or supports our prior beliefs or values. Now, in psychology, this is known as confirmation bias. And people who really, it highlights this concept that people who hold strong opinions or on complex issues like, for example, capital punishment, they're likely to examine relevant empirical evidence in a very biased manner. And as a result, they'll accept confirming evidence. This is congruent to how I feel at face value, but then very critically examine anything that doesn't jive with, their beliefs. And this is a problem in design research, and it can occur in quite a few ways. Firstly, when we focus too much on test findings that validate the desired outcome. I've been, as a designer, just as guilty of this, where I really start to kind of hone in on things that validate the design solution that I've done. And this is exactly, as designers, what you should avoid, right? You should be challenging your design solution as much as possible, even if that means kind of, poking holes in your current held kind of beliefs or values. Additionally, we can block out or become more critical when receiving feedback that doesn't validate or support the design direction we prefer. Design critiques or design reviews are a critical part of the design creation process. And yet, if we get the feedback that only is positive and confirmational and nothing that's too critical, we're kind of missing out on that, very kind of constructive feedback that helps create more resilient digital products and services, and really overall better design. Luckily, there's a few ways we can mitigate the effects of confirmation bias. Firstly is multifaceted user research. Feedback is great for understanding, how users are thinking, but not so great in terms of, understanding their actions. We've probably all heard the saying in UX research that, you should pay attention to what users do, not what they say. And that's a very kind of critical piece of feedback because, oftentimes what people say and what they do are completely different. Okay, nextly, we should use a combination of user interviews, usability testing, and quantitative analysis to really understand people's actions. So we're not just kind of listening to what they're saying or honing in on one research method. We're kind of using a trifecta of user research methods to really kind of identify what's really happening. Okay, so the next thing we can do is something called red team, blue team. Executional teams can easily fall in love with their initial idea. I've been on teams that are just as guilty of this, where you think you have the best solution possible, and you just fall in love with it, and you start to kind of get that confirmation bias, where you're very critical of anything that is contrary to what you're suggesting with the design. A good way to mitigate this is to designate a separate team, the red team, to pick apart the design and find all the flaws. The objective here is to discover the biases embedded in the design output of the team and avoid the pitfalls of falling in love with the wrong idea. So it's really about blue team creates a solution, red team pokes holes in it, and that is their designated kind of role in really kind of helping the product, the design, to be much more resilient. Another thing we can do to mitigate confirmation bias is really kind of be cognizant of overly optimistic interpretations of the data. We must be diligent not to interpret data the wrong way, especially if the interpretation favors the desired outcome. Secondly, we can watch for overly optimistic interpretations of research and findings through our design feedback. So whether it's our research or the feedback, really kind of being a little kind of diligent about honing in anytime it's overly optimistic is always a good thing, and a very kind of effective way of rooting out when these biases might be creeping into your design process. All right, the last one I want to talk about is why we should become aware of our decision frames. Oh, sorry about that. All right, so in 1981, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman explored how different phrasing affected participants' responses to a choice in a hypothetical life and death scenario. In the study, participants were asked to choose between two treatments in a 600 people study affected by a deadly disease. So this is all hypothetical, and people were asked, to basically make a choice, A or B, and it would be a life or death scenario. So treatment A was predicted to result in 400 deaths if it was administered, whereas treatment B had a 33% chance that no one would die, but a 66% chance that everyone would die. So, much more kind of dire situation. The choice was then presented to participants either with positive framing, meaning how many people would live, or with negative framing, so how many people would die. And it was treatment A that was chosen by 72% of the participants when it was presented with positive framing. It would save 200 lives, dropping to 22% when the same choice was presented with negative framing, meaning 400 people would die. And I think this study does a great job of highlighting something very interesting in human psychology, in that we have a tendency to make decisions based on whether the options are presented with positive or negative connotations, meaning if it's a loss or if it's a gain. The choice of participants in this study really kind of highlighted this. And in psychology, this is known as the framing effect. And really, it affects all aspects of the design process, from interpreting research findings to even selecting design alternatives. So how does this occur? Well, it begins with how we phrase our questions during interviews or usability tests. And this can actually have a significant impact on the response of participants. Sometimes you can lead or frame up questions during usability or interviews that really kind of, prime participants to answer in a very specific way. The other is how we choose to present the research findings to our broader team or stakeholders. So really, instead of making a decision based on, basically presenting these and trying to make decisions can really be affected in basically how we frame it up and communicate it. And then finally, overly specific feedback can frame up the problem in a way that really limits the design solution overall, or it influences it in a way that leads to overlooking very important considerations. So in other words, not having enough information. So how can we mitigate this? Well, the first thing we can do is really think through context, right? Solutioning when we should still be gathering information can be a constant challenge. And while it may be tempting to jump to design solutions right away, taking a little bit more time to think through context will significantly impact how we interpret the data overall. Finally, we should take a little bit of time to think through the context that will significantly impact how we actually interpret the data. So it's only once we spend some more time, ample time with the gathered data, that we can begin to really synthesize it and really identify useful insights from it, and really kind of start to hone in on patterns that aren't as obvious on the surface. The next thing we can do is gather more context. Doing things like waiting until we have enough to make an informed decision. Instead of making a decision based on however much data we have, we can hold it a bit and wait until there's enough there to where we're very comfortable with making a design decision. Secondly, sometimes research it uncovers what we need to learn more about. So there's not always answers. Sometimes it's really kind of leads to additional things that we need to research. And finally, we'll know when we have enough information to make an informed decision, when we have a clear idea of the problem and sufficient information to begin a solution. The second thing we can do is really switch our view. Perceive the data from another angle to avoid emphasis or exclusion of specific information. And we can take the opposite approach to articulating the problem. So we could say, we're gonna articulate it from another angle that's contrary to kind of our original hypothesis and see how it stands up. All right, just to summarize some key guidelines. We can consider what we don't see by factoring in failure. We can avoid building solutions in search of a problem by using multifaceted user research, critically examining our work, things like red team, blue team, and watch for overly optimistic interpretation of data. And finally, we can become aware of our decision frames through things like thinking through the context, gathering more context up front, and then switching our point of view to really think about the problem from a different angle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jon. It was very, very, very interesting, and as usual. I don't know if anyone wants to add a comment or place a question directly to Jon and use the opportunity at this point. If it's something that can be directly related to the presentation, I know it's lots of information, and so maybe we let digest and ask Justin to show. I thank you very much, Jon. I think it was interesting to catch you both, Jon and Justin. So I think, and I hope that will be some kind of mutual sharing there. So yeah, I asked Justin to step in. Thank you, Jon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hello, Pedro. Nice to finally see you. We've been going back and forth for how long now? Years.
Yeah, changing emails.
Yeah. Great, so thanks for the invitation to come and present. I have a PowerPoint, so let me see if I can open that up.
I don't know if Justin, you will present yourself. Justin is doing a really interesting work with a group of researchers and just published a book about user experience and public space design. So I think he will present himself. So
okay, great. And so I have until 11:50. We say half hour, right? Okay.
Yes.
Definitely let me know if I seem to be going over. I'll try to be concise. Well, yeah. So it's just it's wonderful to be here, and I've enjoyed the chance to listen to some of the other panels. So, really, I want to kind of talk about some of the ways that biometrics kind of play into a lot of these conversations, and I do want to kind of touch on some stuff that we've been thinking about a lot, I think, with respect to the pandemic. So, you think about all of these public spaces that have been shut down, and in some parts of the world they've been opening up, and it really just helps us kind of realize that's really not good for us, and that we really need to see other people, that this desire to be in a social setting with crowds is much bigger than we might have appreciated beforehand. And so a lot of this research that I've been doing has really kind of taken a certain perspective that's grounded in evolution, that it's not random that we want to be with other people. That's how we evolved as a social species, and that there's certain programming built into our brains that we're born with that makes us want to seek out, certainly looking at other people, but also certain patterns, shapes, colors. And that when we see these, that it in our mind, an autonomic response is generated. And so it can put us at ease, it can make us feel more comfortable, and that we can kind of grow and develop in a healthy way. So Sigmund Freud, back in the 19th century, talked about how the mind is like an iceberg. It floats with 1/7 of its bulk above water. That it's that unconscious that scientists today believe actually represents even more than 6/7. That we're mainly experiencing the world around us in public spaces, in buildings, in architecture, where we're experiencing it mainly unconsciously. And so this is in many ways the kind of consummate failure of urban planning and design, because we don't do that. We don't plan for the unconscious, and that's really what I want to talk to you guys about today. So in this book that my co-author Ann Sussman and I wrote in 2015, we identified a bunch of principles. And this actually book was just updated, and a second edition is coming out in a couple weeks. So these principles are based on what we did was we looked through the psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science literature around the built environment and how people experience places. And we culled through hundreds of articles and books and whatnot, and we came up with these principles. We kind of organized them around, and actually many of these principles are basically taught today in urban planning, architecture, design schools, but not all of them. And more importantly, now we have the science. The science is there to support many of these, and that's really what I'm going to be arguing in my presentation, that we need to be paying attention to what the science is telling us, and not make these choices about how wide a sidewalk should be, or how tall a building, or what form it should have, based on style or some sort of abstract, subjective notion. And even just asking people, you're not necessarily going to get an answer that's valid and reliable, because of like some of the framing stuff the last speaker talked about. There's a lot of biases in there, and that we don't really experience the world that much on a conscious way. So you're asking people consciously to respond, and you might not get answers that are going to be useful. So when we talk about the principles, the first one, edges matter. Here you see the Piazza del Campo in Siena, Italy, for hundreds of years has been a go-to desirable public space. They've done a really good job there of creating high quality edges, well-defined corridor, encourages people to walk along. because we are a wall-hugging species, as are most animals wanting to seek out edges. Second principle is that patterns matter. We certainly have 5 senses, but the human mind prioritizes vision. Vision is the most important sense that is feeding into our mind. So if you think about all of the information that's coming into your mind at any given moment, you can kind of make an analog to the bits and bytes of computers. So in every second is about 15 million bits of information. And of that 15 million, about 10 million is coming in through your eyes. So you certainly are other information is coming in through the other senses. 10 million is coming through your eyes. But here's what's really interesting. I mentioned that quote with Freud. Well, of the 10 million bits per second coming into your mind, you're only capable of consciously processing 50 of those bits. So what that's telling us is that you're really experiencing autonomically all the other information, and your body is essentially trying to make sense of it, and your mind is trying to process on an unconscious level all that information, but you're only consciously kind of aware of, and you can really think about only about 50 of those bits. So when we talk about the vision, it's the face, the human face, which scientists have shown us over and over again in numerous studies, that's the shape, that's the pattern rather that really matters. It's those 2 dots for eyes, the nose, and then the mouth. That's the pattern, and that's why we see it. We see it in vernacular architecture all over the world. But anywhere where that shape is available, people will connect. They'll emotionally engage with it. They may not realize it consciously, but that's how we were evolved to see the world. So shapes matter too. And so when you think about our biases towards bilateral symmetry, which you see here in Chambord Castle in the Loire Valley of France, the curves better than straight lines, that we're looking for certain types of shapes that are going to make us relax and make us calm. When we see jagged lines, we get scared. They're in many ways believed to evoke the sharp teeth of a predator. So curved lines are better. And the bilateral symmetry also helps us think about whether what we're looking at is a creature that is like a mammal or many reptiles that are bilaterally symmetrical. And so that helps us connect with them. And so this is a biologically innate bias that we have when we're looking at shapes. And in many ways helps explain why certain architecture continues to be of interest to people hundreds of years later. So there's no way you could have missed it in the last presentation. Thank you, John, for telling so many great stories. Well, John and others know that storytelling is key. And storytelling is important in the built environment too, because when we come to a place, it needs to engage with that same storytelling capacity that is so important in the rest of our lives. So the idea of having a beginning, middle, and end. This is a Villa Lante in Italy. So a garden that brings you in, that tells you a story, that has characters, that has a plot. This is what helps us connect to places. This is what makes us feel grounded and connected, and remember them. And this kind of sense of a past helps us create our own identity as we learn about a place. So storytelling is key. And the last one is something that many of you may be pretty familiar with, nature. Nature is important, this idea of biophilia, love of nature. So it's that we really need to have connection with plants and greenery, that we are an artifact of evolution. So we need to be able to connect with these examples. And we are believed to have evolved on the African savanna. So acacia tree like you see in this image, really what we're talking about here. That's the kind of imagery, the primal vista, looking out far into the distance. This is what we need. Okay, so again, we're only aware of a very small percentage of the stuff that's coming into our minds, but eye tracking and eye tracking emulation software allows us to see that, and it can predict what how we respond to the wider landscape. And I started this presentation with the word biometrics. Well, so now we're going to talk about what that really means. This is an eye tracking lab setup. And what you see here is that the subject is looking at the screen, and there's just different movements of these images to try to train the eye tracker. On the top is a camera, on the bottom is another camera, and it's really just looking at his eye movements. It's mapping the path that the eye takes, and it helps us reveal what that unconscious response is, because you don't control your eyes. Well, not that you can't control them. You can decide, oh, I'm going to look to the right or left. But when you're in the first 3 to 5 seconds, when you first see an image, or when you first go outside and look, you're not controlling where your eyes are looking. So it's a window into your unconscious. So I've done a lot of research using this eye tracking. I'm going to show you some examples. I've also done stuff using algorithmic software that helps us predict where a person would look. So it's a lot less expensive and less onerous, and used very widely in the user experience community. So it helps us kind of reveal the hidden thinking of people as they see places. So this is what eye tracking looks like. So on the right is the Stapleton Library in New York City. And you can see that this image represents a lot of the principles in terms of bilateral symmetry, face length, facade that we talked about when we talked about the cognitive architecture principles. So in this case, what we did is we photoshopped out those 2 left and right windows to see kind of how the person took in the image differently. And what you see is right away, they're not looking to the left and the right. Those blank walls, it doesn't see. So this is how the 2 compare. And this is a heat map, just showing the intensity of where the people were looking. And so it's really just, it helps us understand that even a small difference in the design of the built environment can really have a profound effect on how people experience that place. What their unconscious reaction to it is. What if it's a drastic difference? You would also expect the same. So I want to just walk through really quickly a study I did not that far from Boston, looking at a former military base where they've been doing some redevelopment using new urbanist principles, kind of really thinking about the public realm, considering biometrics as a way to kind of predict where people are looking. So they've already built just this one street. And so we use biometrics to analyze how people might look at the street unconsciously. And so in the top image, you see, I showed you before the heat maps. This one on the upper right is a little different. This is a gaze path. So you can see the person first looks here, then here, then here, then here. I mean, so it really encourages them to walk. They're kind of led down this particular design that leads them to walk. Now look over here in the bottom panels. This is a back alley behind these residences, which are really only designed for garages. These are not public spaces. These are not designed to be welcoming. And you can see that they've achieved that. It's very successful. I mean, even the gaze path, you can see the person is not drawn to want to walk down there. This is not a welcoming path that someone might want to stroll around. But here they've been successful. What you see here is really fascinating to me, because, I mean, how long have humans been building columns and flags? Flags go back to the earliest humans. And it's the first things you see. The first things that people see are the columns and the flags. In a building where the flag is in a slightly different position, boom, that's where the person's going to be focusing their attention. They're really looking at flags. And these are all still images. I haven't done it in this study, but in this location, but elsewhere I've done video. And I mean, when you can see the flag flapping, I mean, that's going to be even more compelling. So eye tracking is only part of the puzzle. You know, it doesn't tell us how happy or sad or angry someone is. So, you know, for that, you do other things. You can bring in heart rate. You can look at skin conductance, EEG, and then kind of stuff that Jon was talking about, the self-report. You can just ask people. You know, it's not that that's not useful at all, but I think it's really useful in combination with understanding how they're responding unconsciously. And I did put up here Honda, BMW, GM. So the car companies are using this technology, are using these kinds of biometrics. And so where they're designing cars considering this stuff. So urban planners, you know, really need to be using this as well to be able to design places that are good for people and aren't good just for cars. And it really almost in many ways explains why traditional urban form endures. So on the left, you see a building that's at a private school in Boston. And it was slated for demolition. You know, a bunch of alums protested and they raised the money to restore it. And look at what the eye tracking shows. It shows it looks like a face. You know, so these are people who, as children, they went to the school and they remember that building and they connected with it. They didn't want it to be gone. They loved that building. On the upper right, you see a new library built in Brooklyn, New York City. When you eye track it, you basically don't even see it. You really just can't even see the building. So the question is, in 30 years from now, when that library has reached its useful life, is anyone going to be protesting? Is anyone going to be raising the money? Or is that just going to be demolished? And it's going to be a terrible waste of resources, where you see the historic building on the left. We expect it to be continued to be protected and preserved. So I've kind of started this talking about public spaces and the need to keep people far away when we socially distance, but clearly what the biometrics are revealing is that we need to see other people, we need to be close to people, and so focusing on these principles are really key to kind of reducing stress levels and making people feel comfortable and healthy during the pandemic. So I was really happy early this year to publish this book. And really it's a pun on user experience. You know, so much about what user experience does is really to try to bring together the psychology, the biometrics, to understand kind of how people are responding to objects or products or services. And so really what we're trying to do in this book is to try to mess around with the language a little bit. So it's urban experience plus design. So UX design as a way for us to try to think about the built environment and that the public realm as a place that we can apply the user experience concepts. And so this was an edited book, and so just came out. And I really appreciate the chance to be here. Welcome any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Justin. I think it had triggered interest for sure on, at least from what I know, of several researchers that are along with this conference that deal with lots of images in public space and all the usage of the public space. It's conforming our reality. So if someone has any question, Isabel, please. Thank you.
Hi, Justin. Thank you for the conference. So my question is more about how we perceived architecture according to, and patterns according to your study, to biometrics. And I was thinking if the brain is like a muscle, and I think it has been proved that the architecture of the brain can in fact be altered and changed. Is it possible that in the future we can change the way we perceive things, and maybe those patterns are modified, and maybe we don't appreciate or associate, I don't know, symmetry to positive feelings, for example, as we do today? You know what I mean? Or maybe colors. If from outside we keep changing the patterns so that to force our brain architecture. I don't know if I'm expressing myself properly.
Yeah, well, thank you, Isabel. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of opportunities for that kind of brain plasticity to meld and change our architecture of our brains. So that's on the kind of on the edges. I think what I'm trying to do in this work is get across this idea that so much of the way that our brains operate and respond to the built environment is fixed, and that plasticity is really just around the edges and pretty minor. And I think that we all, being kind of the evolved mammals that we are, like, we want to think that we're so smart and that we can kind of overcome our nature. But I think that's really what I'm pushing up against, that our ability to do so is very limited, and that ultimately we are basically just bipedal mammals. We roam the earth, walking at 2 to 3 miles per hour. Our heads are tilted roughly about 3 degrees, and it just all comes in. All that information comes in, and we just, to try to fight that and try to adjust the way that people think through various types of techniques, I think is a losing battle. I think we are better off just really trying to understand the human nature, and the design places that people are going to feel comfortable and want to return to.
Thank you. It's just because in the morning we had sessions on transhumanism. So this is where my mind comes from. So they were proposing almost the opposite, right? So maybe if we are exposed to, I don't know, diagonal lines and certain visual things, maybe our brain gets adjusted in a way. So this is where my question came.
Yeah, I mean, in a traumatic way, so that's terrible. And so you may end up being traumatized and emotionally scarred for life, seeing too many diagonal lines. But no, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, my understanding of the science is that people are impacted. And one of the things actually we write about in that urban experience and design book is the fact that war actually really played a critical role in shaping the modern architecture movement, primarily World War I, and the way that many of the founders of the modernist movement were just literally scarred from the trauma. It's too many diagonal lines, or in their case, watching so many of their friends being killed and shell shock. And so yeah, I mean, so that plasticity is real, and those people really responded. We have this whole thing about Walter Gropius, who's a very famous German architect who founded the Bauhaus. So when he came to the United States, he became a leading figure in architectural education in the United States at Harvard, the Graduate School of Design, and he built a house in outside of Boston, and it looks like a bunker. I mean, the house literally looks like a bunker, and it has all of the elements that he experienced during this very traumatic time when he was fighting in the Great War. So I think that what you're saying is true. I think that we are impacted, but let's not like mass traumatize people just so that they can respond better to that context.
Anyway, I was happy to see how biometrics, which is something that I usually associate to control, can be applied in a beautiful and positive way, as you presented. So thank you.
Great. I want to share also that from one part in that vein of thinking that our mind are individually and collectively evolve in a certain point. I think it becomes true, but very slowly. Although the fundamentals, as I agree with Justin, remain, we evolve slowly. We learn to adopt acquired tastes. Like for instance, in music, lots of the today's music, if you placed in the you know in the years of Mozart or Beethoven or the classic ones, they didn't understand it. You know, even jazz, for instance, it were like anti concept at the time. Even the some abstract forms and the exception of abstract painting, for instance, you have a abstract painting in your back. It's not even figurative, it's just abstract, you know. So it's acquired tastes and our minds evolve in a certain aspects. But I fully agree that we still suffer the consequences of the modern movement and postmodern movement, and you know, all this flux and reflux. And I feel like that where do you see the place of graffiti and street art on this complexity? Because actually graffiti and street art, they actually compete for this visual presence on public space. They compete with other forms in public space, and somehow the artists, the graffiti writer or the street artist, they know upfront where to place their tag or where to place their image, so it makes sense or to be more appealing. And on this, it's a learned curve, I think. Also, it's not any question, just some comments. And there's I want to claim your attention to the chat. There's a question from Einat. She can't speak because she's with kids, and she places a question there. Justin, how do you relate changing fashions throughout the years and evolution? This is a question from Einat, from Israel, actually.
Yeah, I mean, changing fashions respond to a lot of human needs that are disconnected from evolution. So I was suggesting that the ways that different styles and architecture and urban planning have changed over the years, are less relevant when we think about what people need from an evolutionary biology perspective. So I mentioned that, but it's not that those fashions don't play any role. They're not connected to what we need from an emotional or unconscious basis. So I think that we can't ignore the fact that we do have a conscious, and that we are very aware, and that allows us to be involved in this stimulating conversation. And I think to come back to Pedro's point about the graffiti art, I mean, most graffiti art is not engaging us at that emotional unconscious level. It's engaging with us at a conscious level to try to communicate something often very political. So there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's just that as urban planners and designers, we need to be aware of how we're engaging with people at the unconscious level, and not to simply just say, well, I'm gonna design this street in a way, or this plaza in a way that's gonna make people really think hard, or kind of engage with them on a political level. You can't just do that, because if you're doing that, then you're ignoring the fact that they need to be engaged at the other level, at that unconscious level. Hopefully that answered your question. You can chime in.
Yeah. You were very clear at the start, because it's the big chunk of information that we receive. It's not processed rationally. So this needs to be designed, and it's a lack of design at this level that's huge. You know, it's even we do not know where to start, actually, I think. And you are tackling this, the tip of the iceberg of this dimension. You have here another question from Emilia. Emilia, please.
Yes, hello. I have another question for Justin. I was wondering if you were perhaps inspired by Gestalt aesthetics while formulating these rules that you were talking about during your speech, because I believe they were the first thinkers or psychologists that spoke about a natural prediction, a natural human prediction to symmetry and to dividing the shapes from its surroundings and so on and so on. So I was curious if you were perhaps inspired by them or not at all.
Well, not specifically. I think that the Gestalt theories have, in therapy at least, have influenced more broadly the conversation and scholarly literature in psychology. So yeah, I think that particularly the bilateral symmetry is a big part, but no, not me personally. It's not that I've really been excited about what they've done. It's more just that I think they've contributed to the larger conversation, and that's useful. So
okay, because I think that there was specific part of their aesthetic thought that is very similar to yours, to your rules and to your, I would say, research. So I was just curious, but okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely read up more. Thank you for the suggestion. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's here another. Isabel, you wrote here.
It's not a question. It was a comment.
It's a comment. Yeah. Great. Okay. I don't know if someone else wants to add something to Justin's presentation or Jon presentation. Okay. If not, I think we conclude on time, let's say. And now I have my other kid here also, so there are two now. So we are complete.
I don't think you have a good connection.
We can start our travel, and I've recorded, and hopefully I will listen to you. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, everyone. Exactly. Thank you. Stay well. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
See you tomorrow. Bye.